Alright. Hello, everyone. We are coming in for the first video of December of 2025. It's hard to believe that it's almost Christmas already and a new year is already nearing upon us. So, for the first video for this month, I've decided that we're going to go ahead here since we have not done one in a while. We have not done one of our president's videos, I think, since at least, I want to say September, August, probably. So I wanted to go ahead here and do at least one more before the year went out. So the last president that we covered was John F. Kennedy, JFK, very well known president to most people. Most unfortunately, mostly because he was the last president so far to have been assassinated. So today we're picking up with pretty much the day that Kennedy was assassinated, because upon Kennedy's death, his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ was his nickname, became president upon Kennedy's death. And he's going to remain in office for the next couple years because he's going to get his own term. So we are going to cover Mr. Johnson today and discuss, as we usually do with these videos. For anyone new to these, we go through a little bit of the early lives, their careers before they were presidents, and then we go into the presidency itself and any significant events that happened afterward, if there's any. So, for Lyndon Johnson, he was born on August 27th, 1908, in central Texas Hill Country near Johnson City, which was named after a distant relative of his. His parents were Sam Ailey Johnson Jr. and Rebecca Baines Johnson. Lyndon was the eldest of five children that his parents had. His father was a farmer, businessman, and a Texas state legislator. So that's going to influence Johnson very early on. His dad is involved in politics, and that is going to draw him into the fold very early on. And most people, from what they know of Lyndon Johnson, they tend to kind of have some criticisms towards some of his welfare programs that he really puts into play during his presidency, and many of them that we still have. I'm not saying welfare is perfect. It's definitely got its issues. I do think there's people cheating off the systems, but I don't think it's as widespread as many people believe. And on top of that, if carried out to its full basic extent, welfare programs do serve a general good purpose. It's just when they're exploited, they can be changed, but that's a whole nother debate for another time. So Johnson grew up in a small farmhouse on the Pedernales River in Texas. The small family home had no electricity and no running water during his early years, so they pretty much live in almost poverty-like conditions, and that would shape Johnson later on in life, especially toward his Great Society agenda during his presidency. In 1913, the Johnson family moved to Johnson City, out of the little farmhouse that they had grown up in. Lyndon would often accompany his father while he would campaign for office and for the Texas state legislature. By age 10, Lyndon was also joining his father in the state capital of Austin, Texas, for listening to floor debates that were happening in this Texas state capitol building. He was also listening to behind the scenes deals that his father was cutting with local politicians and all the ins and outs of politics that he would end up very much divesting in himself once he got into the field. But this was something that he first witnessed visiting the Texas state capitol with his dad during his childhood. And here is a picture of Johnson around that time. This would be him around age 7 in 1915, wearing a cowboy hat. In 1924, Johnson would graduate from high school. He would graduate from a six-member senior class as its president. So, yes, he was president of the senior class, but they also didn't have many kids. He did not wish to go to college, which was unfortunate because his parents did want him to go to college. It was something that they very much pressed on Lyndon that they wanted him to do, but he had no interest in wanting to go to college at the time. So instead, he kind of went out with a couple of buddies. They went out to California, and for a couple of years, he was kind of a wanderer in California with his friends as they took several odd jobs in the state, and that's how they made their money. In 1927, so about 3 years after deciding that he's gonna go, do these odd jobs at California, just hang out with friends and enjoy adult life, he ultimately comes to the decision that he will enroll in college after all. In 1927, Johnson would enroll in Southwest Texas State Teachers College, which is now Texas University, after borrowing $75 from a friend in order to pay the enrollment fee. And this was something that I think Johnson picked up from his parents. Both of his parents had at one point been teachers themselves, and this was a career that I think Johnson felt that he could take on. And it was something his parents had done. He felt nothing was bad with it, and he had interest in it himself. So that is in 1927. While in college, he worked as both a janitor and an office helper while enrolled in order to help pay his tuition costs. He would also teach for a year at a school for disadvantaged Mexican American students, which end up shaping his views on both poverty and discrimination, which he experienced quite extensively when he was doing his teaching at this one school. He witnessed the discrimination that Mexican Americans faced at the time in the United States, while at the same time he recognized that many of these kids came from, immigrant families that didn't have a whole lot of money and often lived in poverty. And that often affected, school supplies, being able to even attend school, being able to come to school. He recognized that. He would graduate from college in 1930, and Johnson came away from his college years with a very, very big appreciation for education, realizing that it was a vital part to his own success and that he would recommend it to almost anybody, and that it needed to be more accessible to a wider portion of the population. Because, in Johnson's own words, education is the key to meaning in life. He felt that education was kind of, in some ways, a key to also lifting one's self out of poverty and out of poor conditions and being able to better oneself. And Johnson was a firm believer in that, and that would be another thing that he would pursue when he was president. The onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, however, meant that teacher jobs paid very little. And although Johnson had just graduated college, he couldn't really find any well paying teacher jobs to go into the field right off the bat. So this kind of influenced the career path that he would ultimately take. He had went to school to become a teacher. He ultimately would not become a teacher. He instead would soon be drawn to the career of politics. Newly elected U.S. Congressman at the time, Richard Clayburgh, asked Johnson to come to Washington, D.C. to work as his top aide there on his staff. Johnson would accept this proposal that Clayburgh put to him. He would go to Washington, serve as the leading member of Clayburgh's staff. Clayburgh would even let him kind of run the staff office a little bit. And while there, Lyndon would learn the political process and meet several influential people in Washington who might be able to help him start his own political career should he choose to do so. He would learn how politics ran on the national level compared to just in, the Texas state level that his dad had been in. In September of 1934, while home in Texas, Johnson would end up meeting Claudia Alter Taylor through a mutual friend. Now, most of us know that they would eventually marry, or as we know, she's not often called Claudia. She's often known as Lady Bird. That was kind of a quip in the Johnson family, was that they have the initials LBJ. His was Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lady Bird Johnson, LBJ had the same thing. It was a family thing that they did. And this what he eventually would call her, but her real name was Claudia Alter Taylor. And he would ask her to marry him on the very first date. Quite bold for a man to ask a woman on the very first date that, "Hey, will you marry me?" She, of course, did not say yes the very first date. She still had her qualms. She wasn't going to say, "Oh, yeah, we just met. I'm sure I'll marry you." So she decides, "No, let me think about it a little bit." She was unsure. So instead, Lyndon asked her to write to him every single day while he went back to Washington, D.C. They would eventually marry very quickly. They met in September of 34, and on November 17th of that year, they ended up getting married. So it was only about a 2 month dating period before they actually decided to marry. Johnson, while in Washington, D.C., was starting to become a very big supporter of the New Deal programs sponsored by the Democratic Party and President Franklin Roosevelt. He would return home in 1935 to become Texas director of the National Youth Organization, which was an organization set up during the Great Depression as part of the New Deal to help young people find jobs and volunteer work so that they could earn money for themselves and maybe help their families out. Johnson would also support rural electrification after being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937 and would highly go after trying to get, electricity and electric lines out to people in the more rural parts of the country so that everybody had access to electricity, something that he had not had when he was a child. Johnson was appointed to the House Committee on Naval Affairs at President Roosevelt's request and became a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve. during his time as a U.S. representative in the House. In 1941, Johnson would lose his only political race that he ever truly lost, which was a run for the Senate, but he did maintain his current seat in the House that he held. So he maintained his seat in the House. Unfortunately, at the time in 1941, he was not able to win a race for the Senate. After Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into World War II, Johnson would volunteer for active duty, along with several other congressional members who wanted to go into active service to serve their country. Johnson actually requested to President Roosevelt personally that he place him as soon as possible on active duty, which Roosevelt complied. On December 9th of 1941, a day after the U.S. would enter the war, Johnson was assigned to the Pacific Theater, at which he would report to the following May, I believe it was. In 1942, while in the Pacific, he would receive a Silver Star from General Douglas MacArthur for gallantry in an aerial combat mission over Japanese occupied New Guinea. He would return to Washington in July of that year and wore the Silver Star on his jacket or his suit the rest of his life. He never would not wear that star. He took it as a badge of honor. He would return in July 1942 because President Roosevelt had recalled all active service congressional members to come back to Washington. In 1948, after World War II was finished, Johnson would be elected to the U.S. Senate finally after losing his initial race in 1941, but he won the Democratic primary in the Senate seat that he ended up getting. He won the Democratic primary by a mere 87 votes. It was a very tight primary, but once he actually got the Democratic nomination, he did win that Senate race. In 1953, at age 44, he was the youngest person to ever become minority leader in the Senate. And he would become one of the youngest majority leaders when Democrats would win control of the Senate in 1955 after the midterm elections. In 1966, well, not 66, but in 1960, Johnson felt politically prepared to run for president. He felt that he had gotten quite the congressional career. He had been in politics on the national level since 1937. He felt that, I can run for president. I'll try to run for the Democratic nomination. Much to Johnson's chagrin, he lost to very young Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, who decided that he was going to run that year as well. And he ended up losing the Democratic primary to Kennedy. Kennedy, as part of a reconciliation move and also a move to garner votes in the South that might have had were kind of cautious about Kennedy for his stances on civil rights. He was a Northerner, he was a Yankee. He was not someone that they really wanted to vote for. And the South was typically a Democratic stronghold. You needed to have votes there in order to get to the presidency. So Kennedy did offer Johnson the spot as his VP, as his running mate, and Johnson did accept that post in order to gain support from Southern conservative Democrats who might otherwise be cautious about voting for Kennedy. And Kennedy, of course, did win the 1960 presidential race against Republican Richard Nixon and his running mate Henry Cabot Lodge. And Johnson would officially become vice president on January 20th of 1961 when the Kennedy administration began. Johnson would grow worried, however, upon ascending to the vice presidency over his traditional role as an ineffective, kind of office holder. Up till through the 1960s, vice presidents typically weren't that all that active in the presidential administrations that they served. They were kind of on the sidelines. Yes, they were president of the Senate, but they could only vote in the event of a tie, and that kind of relegated the vice president to kind of sitting on the sidelines and really having a whole lot of important deals. And that wasn't Johnson's style. He liked to be up in front. He liked to be in the political mess. He liked to be doing stuff. And he grew worried over the traditional role that the vice president had and worried that it would, be a hindrance to him. So while he's vice president, Johnson starts advocating he wants increased involvement in the executive branch in the everyday doings of the administration. And this was something unheard of for a vice president to request at the time. Now, Kennedy generally agreed to Johnson's request, though it may have partially been out of a fear that Johnson would break with the administration and the press, of which at this point Johnson's been in Congress since 1937. He's been in national politics. He knows quite a few newspaper editors and national newspapers. If he doesn't agree with something that the Kennedy administration is doing, he probably will not hesitate to criticize them publicly in the press and the papers. And that was something Kennedy did not want happening. So, in large part, he did agree with Johnson on a lot of his requests that he demanded. Many of Kennedy's staff, on the other hand, including his own brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, or RFK, and other cabinet members, were openly opposed to Johnson and very much didn't trust him. During his vice presidency, Johnson would try to actively take part in Kennedy's goals. He would visit Berlin during the Berlin Wall crisis during the 1961. He would lead the U.S. space program after Kennedy would officially set forward with the create it had been created during Eisenhower. NASA had been created under President Eisenhower after the Sputnik had been launched. But Kennedy would really amp up NASA and up the space program. And it was actually supposedly Johnson's recommendation to Kennedy that the way to beat the Soviets in the space race would be to get a manned mission to the moon successfully done. And this was supposedly where that idea come from. How true it is, I don't know if we know for certain, but we do know that Kennedy ultimately, after he had pitched that his goal for NASA in the next decade was to send a manned mission to the moon, Johnson would be pretty much put in charge of the U.S. space program in order to accomplish that goal. Before we continue here, so here we have a picture of Johnson meeting with President FDR in 1937 at the time that he entered and was elected into the U.S. House of Representatives. So here's FDR, and over here is Johnson shaking hands with him. The guy in between is the governor of Texas at the time. Here we have a picture of Johnson as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve during World War II in 1942, where he would receive a Silver Star for his service. Here we have one of Johnson's main senatorial portraits during his time as a senator in the 1950s. And then here we have a picture of Johnson with President Kennedy on the White House grounds in August of 1961. So, as we all know, Johnson was not elected president the first time around. He inherited the office after the tragedy of JFK's assassination, and that is exactly what ended up happening. As we all know from the last video, and most of us probably know, Kennedy was shot by an assassin. It is reported it was Lee Harvey Oswald. It's reported it could have been other people. I don't think we'll ever know absolutely certain if there were other people involved. But tragically, Kennedy dies. Kennedy dies from the assassination. He's the most recent president to have been assassinated in office. And Johnson ends up getting sworn in as president on Air Force One as it's traveling back to DC from Dallas with Kennedy's body, along with, his wife beside him and Jackie Kennedy, who's also beside him, still wearing the pink dress that she had been wearing when her husband had been shot that still has her husband's blood on it. And that was on November 22nd of 1963. Johnson deemed that an immediate transition of power would show stability to a grieving nation. He deemed that it was important to show the world that the United States was not paralyzed from this assassination, that things would continue, things would go on. It was a tragedy that had happened, but the government was functioning, and he wanted to show, you know, this is not going to paralyze us. We're going to continue to operate. There's a president in charge. Unfortunately, Johnson's move to do this in some people's eyes came off as, he's hungry to assume the reins of power. And it kind of started speculating the conspiracy theories of, okay, was Johnson involved in the Kennedy assassination? And did he secretly orchestrate this? Johnson would establish the Warren Commission, which would investigate the Kennedy assassination. And he would overall, publicly, he would agree with the findings that the Warren Commission found that said that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, that he had not had anyone else that had played a part in the assassination attempt. But privately, Johnson was not so sure. And in private remarks that he had made on several occasions throughout the years, he kind of indicated that he maybe thought the Warren Commission hadn't found out the truth. In 1967, to an advisor, Johnson was purported to have remarked that he thought that the CIA was somehow involved in the Kennedy assassination. And he was also purported to remark to another advisor that I can never, that the following quote of, I never believed Oswald acted alone, although I can accept that he pulled the trigger. So whether or not Johnson kind of had inclinations that there was more to Kennedy's assassination than what was publicly let known, we will probably never know. But it seems that privately he was skeptical of the Warren Commission's findings of whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in the assassination. Johnson would also ask, upon assuming the office, that the members of the Kennedy cabinet end up staying, despite the quarrels that he shared with many of them. He asked many of them right off the bat that I know we don't always get along, but would you please consider staying in your posts? I would rather not have to worry about finding new cabinet members at this point in time. And it's probably not the best time to do it when the nation's in a grieving process and we want to portray that the country's going strong. All of his cabinet members, including Robert Kennedy, not Robert Kennedy Jr., he's still alive, but Robert Kennedy, who did not very much get along with Johnson at all, he was acting as Attorney General under his brother, would remain in their posts for most of Johnson's term. Now, two of them would end up leaving. Obviously, Robert Kennedy would end up leaving when he won a Senate seat, I believe, about a year or two later. And then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara would end up leaving in 1967 over disagreement with the administration in Vietnam. But the other members would stay throughout the entirety of Johnson's presidency. Now, Johnson would use Kennedy's legacy to secure the passage of two bills almost immediately within a year that Kennedy had endorsed but had not been able to get passed. A tax cut of 20% in the Revenue Act of 1964, and perhaps more vitally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would officially outlaw segregation on the federal level and on all levels within the country, ending the segregation in the South, which Johnson knew might cause a little bit of a political headache for Democrats, as he reportedly made the remark, "There goes the South," and believing that Democrats may have lost the vote in the South for most of his lifetime, if not for most of his friends' lifetimes. And he was largely correct on that in many ways. After 1964, there was a big demographic shift in voting in the South, which had primarily been a Democratic stronghold since the end of the Civil War, would start transitioning to be more of a deep red area. And at the same time, many African Americans would start moving out of the South to the suburbs, which would be made more affordable through some of the bills that Johnson would pass during his presidency, and they would be able to move to the big cities and the suburbs, which would start kind of diversifying their population a bit more. And with them out of the South, they would probably now vote Democratic since they had gotten their civil rights from them. They were less inclined to stay in the South, and then the people left in the South are angry that civil rights got passed, and they start voting Republican, and it switches the whole demographic rather quickly. Now, Johnson would soon declare a war against poverty through his Great Society agenda. In his own words, to build a great society, a place where the meaning of man's life matches the marvels of men's labor. Johnson himself had grown up in pretty much a poverty situation when he was younger. They had no electricity, no running water. They'd grown up in kind of a farmhouse in central Texas. He knew what poverty felt like. He had also experienced it during his college years when he had taught those Mexican American students in the disadvantaged school that he had taught at for a year, and he had seen it there. So Johnson very much decided his main thing that he wanted to go after as president at home domestically was improving the lives of everyday Americans by improving society and improving living standards. And that was something that he was remarkably actually successful at, and we'll show you here in a second. So in 1964, Johnson would take up the Democratic nomination to run for president in the place that Kennedy would have had the year prior, and Johnson would run for election on his own against Republican Barry Goldwater of Arizona. He would choose Democrat Senator Hubert Humphrey as his running mate. In the 1964 election, Johnson would officially accomplish getting his own presidential term, and it was a landslide election in favor of Johnson. Johnson, you needed at this point, the electoral votes were even to what they are now today. You had 538 members of the Electoral College. You needed 270, just like today, in order to get the presidency. Johnson took away 486 of those electoral votes, with Goldwater only getting 52. Johnson also had one of the largest, if not one of the largest swings in popular vote ever seen in a presidential election. He won 61.1% of the popular vote in the 1964 presidential election, with Goldwater not even getting 40%, getting 38.5. Johnson would win officially 44 states plus Washington, D.C., and Goldwater only captured a measly 6. In 1965, Johnson would achieve another civil rights victory with the Voting Rights Act, which would pretty much made it easier for African Americans to vote and got rid of a lot of the bars that were preventing them from doing so in the South. He would follow it with several legislative acts to enact his Great Society agenda. And part of his move for civil rights in the same time that he would undertake in later years, this was in 1967, he would appoint Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court, who would end up being the first African American justice on the Supreme Court. That was Johnson's doing of appointing him. He would remain on the court, I believe, until he died, and I think that was around 1993 that he died. So Johnson really goes during his presidency, he goes on an all out, like trying to get his great society passed on every way that he possibly could. And we got a slew of acts here that he ended up doing in ways to try to improve American life. The first would be the Fair Housing Act. Well, not the first, but they're not necessarily in order, but these are some of the most significant. So, the Fair Housing Act, 1968, would outlaw housing discrimination, which would allow blacks and other minorities to move into the suburbs more easily. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which would create anti-poverty community programs to try to help set up community programs to help people that were, living poorly. The Food Stamp Act of 1964, which would make permanent the food stamp program that had been started under President Kennedy. It was a temporary program at the time. Johnson would make that a permanent program, which still goes on today. Of course, lately that's come up in a little bit about a month ago when we had the government shut down. We had a little bit of a argument over food stamps because they were actually not going to go out for November, and then they did, or at least some of them did. I don't know if all of them did. You had the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965, which provided rent subsidies for the elderly and disabled, construction of 240,000 urban units, and appropriated $3 billion for urban renewal. So this was a very big help to the elderly and to the disabled people in paying rent. This was a help to building housing in urban areas and revitalizing urban areas. The Appalachian Regional Development Act, which would improve living standards in Appalachia, which was a very big poverty region at the time. The Higher Education Act of 1965, which is still very much in play, which would grant more federal money to colleges/universities, low interest student loans to students to pay for tuition, scholarships, and create the Teacher Corps. Head Start would also be created during Johnson's presidency, which would help prepare children from disadvantaged families for success in school. Head Start is still going strong today. The Public Broadcasting Act, which would provide for educational television programs such as Sesame Street and other things that have premiered on like PBS, for instance. The National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities both were created during Johnson's presidency. And during Johnson's presidency, overall, his efforts to create a great society in America were quite successful, and at least on his war on poverty. Because from 1963 to 1969, poverty would decline in the United States quite significantly during Johnson's Great Society agenda. The national poverty rate went from being 23% when Johnson assumed office in 1963 to going down to 12% in 1969 when he left office. So that is a decline of over 11% through his initiatives. So here we have a picture of Johnson, one of the more famous pictures of him. This is him being sworn in on Air Force One as it's coming back from Dallas with JFK's body. Of course, his wife is right next to him, and then over here we have Jackie Kennedy, who's still wearing her jacket that she had wore, her suit that still had her husband's blood on it, watching him being sworn in. Here we have a picture the 1964 presidential election results, just showing the landslide that Johnson got. Of course, he did lose some of the Deep South states for his passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was a first for a while. And of course, Goldwater also managed to capture his home state of Arizona. But overall, it was a blue wave, one of the largest landslides in history. Here we have a picture of Johnson's wife. This is Claudia Taylor, or Lady Bird Johnson, as we know her. She would be very active during Johnson's presidency, especially toward environmental causes and also with the Head Start program. Here we have a picture of Johnson undergoing his poverty tour in 1964, meeting people that were, experiencing poverty in their lives and weren't living exactly, with the best means available to them. Something that I think a lot of some of our presidents nowadays don't always do, especially the current one. I don't ever see the current one actually going out and greeting people like this ever. And that's something that I think needs to come back. They're elected by the people. They need to go out and meet the people. So here we have a picture of Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Of course, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. are both in this picture as well. And we also have a picture of Johnson with African American Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall in 1967. This was taken on the morning that he nominated Marshall to be named to the court. And another thing that Johnson would do with his Great Society initiative that we still very much depend on is he would also introduce Medicare and Medicaid for, people, government health insurance and health benefits for people to help pay for medical bills and stuff like that when they didn't always have the money. And that was something that still goes on today. Of course, it's definitely got its qualms. Some people claim that it's being abused by some other people. Others, it's vital to how they are able to afford medical care. Because let's be honest, medical costs in the United States are probably one of the highest in the world. They probably are maybe even the highest for a developed country. And it's utterly ridiculous what we have to pay for medical bills. It is. It's utterly ridiculous what we pay. And it needs to be, it very much needs to be reformed. But for some reason, the politicians just can't seem to get that through their heads. Probably because they got enough money, they don't got to worry about that. But to the everyday, ordinary, average American, healthcare costs are absolutely atrocious. And they could be far better. Far better. Of course, though, one thing that we know Johnson's presidency for, and probably the thing that most people remember him for, it is unfortunately the success that he had with his Great Society initiatives. It's something that left a stain on his legacy, and it's left a stain on America, and it's left a bad taste on many Americans' mouths that they don't wish to always revisit. And that, of course, was the Vietnam War. And Vietnam, as many of us know, was a conflict that we did not end up winning. We did end up losing that fight. So despite and just to give a little brief go over here briefly, this is the one thing that really people remember Johnson for, unfortunately, is they remember him for his performance in Vietnam, which I agree. I like what Johnson did with the Great Society, but his performance in getting the US more involved in Vietnam was absolutely wrong, and it should not have been done, and it was absolutely needless. Despite Johnson's success at home, his legacy was stained by Vietnam. The U.S. had been involved in the conflict since 1955, but by the time Johnson took office, there were only around 17,000 personnel in Vietnam prior to 1964. So prior to 1964, we were kind of there in just simply an advising stage. We weren't there to conduct large scale military operations. We were simply advising the South Vietnamese how to defend themselves against the Viet Cong, which was an insurgent communist guerrilla that was operating within the country, or the North Vietnamese to the north, who were intent on reuniting the country under their rule, which they eventually would. Now, what would end up changing Vietnam was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and this came after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where Johnson claimed that a U.S. destroyer had been attacked by two North Vietnamese torpedo boats and had successfully turned them back. What would end up coming about from that incident was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, which gave Johnson blanket approval to repel future attacks on American personnel in Vietnam. And this pretty much started epping away the power of Congress to declare war because Johnson now had pretty much the permission, without ever officially declaring war on the Viet Cong or the Vietnamese or the North Vietnamese, to pretty much conduct military strikes at will without having to have Congress formally declare war in order for him to do so. In 1965, Johnson would begin the U.S. Operation Rolling Thunder, which would continue until 1968, and it was one of the largest, if not the largest, bombing campaign ever undertaken by the U.S. military. It was a massive bombing campaign over northern Vietnam to try to get them to come to the negotiating table and back off, and also to disrupt Viet Cong supply lines. By October of 1965, where just a year before there had only been around 16,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam, just by a year later in 1965, there were over 200,000 active combat troops in the country that were actually starting to take part in combat operations. In 1966 and 67, despite military intelligence suggesting that the U.S. efforts were doing very little to defeat the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, Johnson would repeatedly claim to the public in interviews and on public television that the U.S. was winning, that, this is working. Whirling Thunder is doing its job. We will have these guys at the negotiating table. We are making progress. In 1967, the amount of troops went up another 300,000 to 525,000 troops. By this point, 52% of Americans did not like the Vietnam War, especially among younger Americans, such as those on college and university campuses and academic professors, who started to see through what the administration was telling them and started realizing facts weren't matching up. If we're winning this war, why is it still dragging on? If we're winning this war, why are they still launching these attacks that we keep hearing about in the news? If we're winning this war, why are we deploying more and more troops? In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara resigned when the administration would insist on staying in Vietnam. McNamara had made recommendations based on intelligence that he had that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. That was not something that the U.S. should pursue any further, and he recommended that the U.S. should pull out of the conflict. Johnson's chief of staffs utterly threatened to resign if Johnson chose to withdraw out of Vietnam, claiming that it was too late to back out now. Johnson would ultimately side with them, and McNamara, out of disagreement, would end up resigning from the administration, along with some other things that had come up. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong would launch what we know as the Tet Offensive. They would hit multiple targets in South Vietnam, including the five largest cities there, including the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. The Tet Offensive would utterly destroy the American public's trust in the Johnson administration and what it was telling them about what was going on in the Vietnam War. By this point in 1968, 63% disapproved of the war effort, and the Tet Offensive utterly shattered the notion from the Johnson administration that they were winning the war, because if you were winning this war, how were the communists able to mount such a major offensive and catch them so off guard within the country they were defending? And this woke a lot of people up to realizing the government's not telling us the whole truth about this war. We don't know everything. If we were winning, this would not have been possible. And it shatters public morale. The public opinion of the Johnson administration's handling of the Vietnam War plummets even further. The public starts really advocating that to get out of Vietnam, and Johnson really gets himself in a mess. On college campuses, there were even multiple protesters, and even in DC itself, of people protesting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Especially since the draft was being used at this point, and sending young people over there in massive numbers, even young people that didn't want to be drafted. The Tet Offensive would ultimately convince Johnson that further escalation of the Vietnam War was hopeless to win it, and he started to realize that the U.S. had gotten itself in a bind. This was not a war that was going to be won, and he started to realize we need to get out. The problem was, how do you get out of the war at this point, having committed so much to it, and still try to pull off a save face, which was going to be impossible? He decided instead to engage in peace negotiations with the North Vietnamese, which would continue into October of 1968. During that time, he would slow down the bombing campaigns against North Vietnam. Johnson, in a shock announcement on March 31st of 1968, announced that he would not run for re-election. Now, you might ask, well, didn't he already serve technically 2 terms? No, he didn't. He served one on his own, and according to I believe it is the 24th Amendment. I could be wrong on that one. No, I think it is. So the 22nd Amendment. I don't know why I'm thinking 24th. I'm pretty sure it's the 22nd. I'm going to double check. Yes, it is the 22nd. So my apologies. It is not the 24th. I don't know why I thought it was for a second. But the 22nd Amendment was the amendment that was passed in accordance with, FDR getting those 4 terms in office. It had been passed in the early 1950s. It had been ratified And according to that amendment, there is a provision for if a president has served under a certain amount of time after inheriting the office of their successor, of their predecessor, they are allowed to run for another term on their own. And Johnson had served less than 2 years of Kennedy's term. He had served only about just a little over about a year, only about a year before the election. So about a year and 2 months he served of Kennedy's term. He had less than 2 years, and thus he was eligible if he so chose that he could have run again in 1968. But Johnson ultimately, because of the public turning against him and because of all the other stuff that was going on, decided that it would be in his best interest to not run. He had gotten into the Democratic primaries, but he was having very, very stagnant wins there that were coming very, very slowly. And he started to realize that he did not have support to try to run. So on March 31st of that year, he announced publicly on a television announcement that he would not run again for president. And this was his main sentence that he gave to that regard. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. He would instead that fall, current Vice President Hubert Humphrey would end up getting the Democratic nomination, and he would end up losing the election to Republican Richard Nixon, who would again run in 1968 and actually win this time. And something else that I should mention for Johnson here is something I didn't mention during his presidency part is he had a method of negotiating that was quite controversial, especially if you had never seen this before. He called it the treatment. And he had it when he was a senator as well. He had it when he was a member of Congress. And Johnson would call you into his office and he would do pretty much whatever he had to do here to get you to vote the way that he wanted you to vote or to support his point of view. He would get in your face, he would spit at you, he would get right up, invade your personal space to the point that you felt threatened. And by the time you left the office, you didn't know what had happened. You just knew one thing, he had your vote or he had your support. He had a method of negotiating that was very much about invading someone's personal space and making them feel intimidated, and he called it the treatment. Johnson would return home to Texas after leaving office on January 20th of 1969. He would establish his presidential library in Texas and would also work on writing his memoirs. He would resume heavy smoking, which was a habit that he had ditched after a heart attack in 1955, and it was a habit that he had not done since until after he left office. And many suggest that it could have been because he was, afraid that he was losing. He lost the presidency. He'd hit the height of his life, and now he felt like he was going to be relegated to, a meager retirement. So he went right back to his old destructive habits. He would praise President Nixon's foreign policy during Nixon's administration, but he did express worries about Nixon being pressured to remove American troops from Vietnam before the South Vietnamese were fully ready to defend themselves, which he somewhat ended up proving right on that. But at the same time, Nixon was kind of caught in a bind. The American people wanted out. They didn't much care if the South Vietnamese weren't ready to defend themselves. They just wanted out. He would reluctantly endorse Democratic nominee George McGovern in the presidential election of 1972, partly because during his presidency, McGovern had actually been a critic of Johnson, and thus they weren't on exactly the most friendly of terms. But he would begrudgingly give his last minute endorsement to him. McGovern ultimately would lose the 1972 election in an even larger landslide to Nixon than Johnson had won over Goldwater in '64. Johnson would end up dying of a heart attack on the morning of January 22nd, 1973, at his ranch in Texas at the age of 64. His wife had not been home. She was at a meeting at the time. He had died in his living room, I believe, is where it was. He'd had several, he had had a fatal heart attack that morning. I believe he was dead when the Secret Service came in there to get him, and he was already dead at that time. He ended up having a state funeral, which would be the last presidential funeral until 1994, when Nixon would end up dying, and he was buried on the ranch property itself. So for our last couple pictures here, we have a picture here of Johnson in Vietnam meeting with the American troops there in October 1966. Again, he had done a great job, in my opinion, on the Great Society Initiative, but the one thing most of us remember him for is also the thing that tarnishes his legacy the most, and that is U.S. involvement in Vietnam and his rapid escalation of that involvement. And then here we have a picture of Johnson at his ranch in 1972, just a couple months before he ended up dying. So that wraps up for President Johnson. So that wraps up for him. So again, I think he did a splendid job at the home front. I think domestically, I think a lot of his programs were helpful. Again, I'm not saying they can't be abused, but I think many of them serve a good common purpose when used correctly. But the bad part is, unfortunately, there are people out there that will use those programs not so well today, give him a bad rap. And of course, the involvement in Vietnam gives him an even bigger stain on his reputation. So again, at home, I think he's excellent. At abroad, definitely kind of a failure. So he's a mixed bag. He's a mixed bag. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything of that manner, feel free to put it in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to go through it when I get the chance. As for our next video, I don't precisely know what the topic's going to be yet, so any suggestions, feel free to put them in. I'll be happy to look through them. So this, I think, yep. So that wraps up everything that I need to say. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video when it comes out.